When I walked into the county courthouse, my son barely looked up from his phone, and my daughter-in-law let out a small laugh she didn't bother to hide. I was wearing the same flannel jacket I always wore to check the fences, work boots still carrying a ring of dried mud, my cap in my hands because my mother raised me to take my hat off indoors. To them, I looked exactly like what they wanted me to look like, a tired old man who had wandered somewhere he didn't belong. I heard Melissa lean toward Derek and whisper something behind her hand, and his mouth twitched into that same smug half-smile he'd worn at every family dinner for the last 2 years. But then the bailiff called the courtroom to order, and the judge walked in, and the moment his eyes landed on me, something in his face changed. His steps slowed. His hand, halfway to his gavel, stopped in midair. He stared at me for 3 long seconds like he was looking at a ghost, and then he leaned toward the clerk and said something too quiet for most of the room to catch, but I caught it. That's him. That's the man who wrote the statute. The room went still. Melissa's laugh died in her throat. Derek's smirk slid off his face like water off glass. Neither of them had any idea who I really was. Not yet. My name is Walter Ashford. I'm 68 years old, a widower, and until 3 months ago, I was just a quiet old man trying to get through the days without my wife. If you're settling in to hear this, I'd love it if you'd hit that like button for me. It means more than you know to an old man telling his story to strangers. And if you've got a minute, tell me in the comments what you call your father, or what your kids call you, because I think about that a lot these days, what names mean, and what they're worth when the people who use them stop meaning it. It started on a Tuesday morning in early spring, out at the house I'd lived in for almost 40 years, on the edge of a little town called Fairhaven, about an hour outside of Columbus, Ohio. My wife Doris had passed 18 months earlier, cancer, quick and cruel the way it sometimes is, and since then, the house had gotten very quiet. I kept her garden going because it felt like the least I could do. I fed the birds. I sat on the back steps in the mornings with my coffee and talked to her a little, the way you do when you're not ready to stop. My son Derek lived 20 minutes away with his wife Melissa, and after Doris died, they started coming around more. I was grateful for it, or I thought I was. Derek had always been sharp with numbers. He worked in commercial real estate, always talking about deals and leverage and things I didn't fully follow. And when he offered to help me simplify my finances after the funeral, I said yes, without thinking twice. He was my boy. I'd taught him to ride a bike in the driveway of that same house. I trusted him the way you trust your own blood, which is to say, completely, and without asking why you should. That Tuesday, I walked down to the mailbox at the end of the drive, same as I did every morning, expecting bills and seed catalogs, and maybe a card from my sister in Tucson. Instead, there was a certified letter from the Fairhaven County Treasurer's Office, red lettering across the top, final notice delinquent property tax. I stood there in the cold with the wind cutting through my jacket and read it 3 times before it made any sense. According to the letter, I hadn't paid property taxes in 14 months. The county was fixing to place a lien on the house Doris and I bought the year our daughter was born, the house where I'd carried her casket out the front door, and if the balance wasn't settled within 30 days, they'd begin foreclosure proceedings. That made no sense to me at all, because 4 months earlier I had personally written Derek a check for $22,000, my half of an inheritance I'd received from my mother's estate, specifically so he could consolidate my accounts and make sure everything, including the taxes, was handled cleanly going forward. He'd sat right at my kitchen table with a legal pad and told me it was smarter this way, that at my age I shouldn't have to keep track of a dozen different bills and due dates, that he'd take care of it like I'd taken care of him his whole life. I remember feeling relieved. I remember thinking I was lucky to have a son who cared enough to handle it. I called him standing right there in the driveway, my hands not quite steady, though I told myself it was just the cold. He picked up on the 5th ring, sounding distracted, background noise like he was in a parking lot somewhere. "Dad, hey, I'm actually walking into a closing right now. Can I call you tonight?" I told him no. This couldn't wait. I'd just gotten a foreclosure notice from the county and needed to know what happened to the tax money. There was a pause. Then his voice went smooth in a way that, looking back, should have told me everything. "Dad, calm down. That's gotta be a county clerical error. I paid that in the fall. I'll pull the confirmation and show you tonight, okay? Don't stress about it. That's exactly why you gave it to me to handle." They came by that evening, the 2 of them, Derek's SUV pulling into the driveway, just as the sun was going down behind the old maple Doris had planted the year we married. I laid the notice out on the kitchen table, The same table Derek had sat at 4 months earlier with his legal pad, and asked him to explain it. He barely glanced at the page. "Dad, this is nothing. The county system is a mess. Everybody knows that." I told him the letter was dated 11 days ago, not some old backlog, and asked him to just show me the payment confirmation, the bank record, anything. That's when Melissa stepped in, setting her purse down on the counter with a little too much precision, and said, "Walter, maybe we should talk about something else while we're here. Derek mentioned you've been having some memory trouble." I told her I didn't know what she was talking about. She tilted her head at me with an expression I can only describe as rehearsed sympathy. "Sunday, you called the house asking if Doris had left for her hair appointment yet." My chest went cold, because Doris had been gone a year and a half, and I have never once, not for a single second in 18 months, forgotten that. I told Melissa that never happened. She looked at Derek, and Derek looked at the floor, and then he said, quiet and careful, like he was breaking bad news to a child, "Dad, it happened. We were both there, and it's okay, grief does things to people, especially at your age. Nobody's judging you." I sat very still at that kitchen table, and felt the floor tilt underneath me. Just for a second, the way it does when someone you trust looks you dead in the eye and hands you a lie so calmly, you start to wonder if maybe you're the one who's wrong. I have never called that house looking for Doris. I know my own mind, but I also know what it looks like when two people have rehearsed a story on the drive over. Because I spent 31 years as a family court judge in this state before I retired, and in 3 decades on the bench, I watched more manufactured concern than most men see in 10 lifetimes. I know the particular cadence of a lie that's been practiced in a car. Derek and Melissa had that cadence down cold. But you understand, a father wants, more than almost anything else, to believe his son. Even a judge who spent his whole career reading people for a living will talk himself out of what he's seeing when it's his own boy sitting across the table. So I let it go that night. I told myself grief really does strange things. That maybe the stress of losing Doris really had scrambled something in me that I couldn't feel from the inside. I apologized. I actually apologized, at my own kitchen table, for a phone call I never made. Derek patted my shoulder on his way out and told me not to worry about the taxes. He'd get it straightened out with the county. I just needed to rest. I watched their taillights disappear down the road and stood in my dead wife's kitchen, feeling smaller than I had in years. The next morning, before the sun was even fully up, Melissa let herself in the back door with a key I didn't remember giving her, carrying a small, unlabeled bottle of white capsules. She set it on the counter next to the coffee maker with a gentleness that felt, even then, slightly performed. "Dad, Derek and I talked to Dr. Halloran yesterday," she said, though I'd never once been in the same room as any doctor named Halloran. "He agrees the stress of losing Mom has really been hard on your memory. These are just a mild supplement, nothing serious, just to help you stay sharp." I looked at that bottle sitting on my counter and felt something old and sharp wake up in the back of my mind. The same instinct that used to tell me, from the bench, when a witness was about to lie under oath. 31 years of watching people's hands and eyes and the half-second hesitation before a rehearsed answer. That instinct said, very clearly, "Do not take that pill." But she was my daughter-in-law. She was the girl who'd cried at my son's wedding and called me Dad from the very first Thanksgiving. I told that old, suspicious part of myself to sit down and be quiet, that a judge's instincts were built for courtrooms, not kitchens, and that I owed my family the same benefit of the doubt I'd have given any stranger. So I took the pill. I swallowed it with my coffee while she watched, and she smiled and kissed my cheek and told me she'd check in tomorrow, and then she was gone, and I stood alone in my kitchen with a strange, heavy fog already starting to creep in behind my eyes. Over the following weeks, that fog never really lifted. I'd wake up groggy, no matter how early I went to bed. I'd lose whole afternoons, not memories exactly. More like time itself seemed to go soft and slippery, hours disappearing between one cup of coffee and the next. Derek and Melissa came by almost every day now, always with a new small kindness, always leaving a fresh bottle of those white capsules on the counter when the old one ran low. And each visit, there'd be some new detail added to the story of my decline. I'd left the stove on. I'd wandered into the neighbor's yard in my pajamas. I'd called Melissa Doris on the phone. None of it happened. I know that with everything in me, but they said it with such calm, documented certainty, dates and times and little sympathetic looks between them, that I started keeping a private notebook just to track my own days, terrified that maybe, somehow, they were right, and I was the one losing the thread. It was that notebook that saved me. In the end, though not in the way I expected. Because one evening, flipping back through 3 weeks of entries, I noticed the fog was always worst on the days right after Melissa's visits, and clearest on the rare days she didn't come. I stopped taking the pill the next morning and simply hid it under my tongue until she left, then spat it into a napkin and sealed it in a sandwich bag. By the third day, without the capsules in my system, the fog was gone completely, and my mind was as sharp as it had been the morning I read that foreclosure notice. And once my head was clear, I finally let myself see what I'd been refusing to see for a month. My own son and his wife were drugging me, gaslighting me, and building a paper trail to have me declared incompetent. I want to tell you what happened next wasn't easy, because it wasn't. Every instinct in me wanted to march over to their house and lay every card on the table, to demand the truth, to grab my son by the shoulders and ask him how he could do this to the man who taught him to tie his shoes. But 3 decades on the bench teaches you something else too. It teaches you that confronting a liar before you have proof only hands them the chance to rewrite the story again, and to use your anger as fresh evidence of your instability. If I came at them now, half-cocked and furious, I'd only be handing Melissa her next line. See? This is exactly what we've been telling everyone. So instead, I did something that cost me more than almost anything else in my life. I kept playing the confused old man. I let my shoulders slump a little more each visit. I let my voice waver. I let them believe they had already won. And quietly, behind that performance, I went to work the way I used to work. A difficult case from the bench, patiently, methodically, and without ever showing my hand. I drove myself, alone, to a small independent lab 2 towns over and paid cash to have that sealed capsule tested. The results came back a week later. A mild sedative combined with an off-label memory-fogging compound. Nothing that would show up on a standard toxicology panel unless someone knew exactly what to look for. I drove to the county assessor's office in person and discovered, sitting right there in black and white on public record, that the $22,000 I'd given Derek had never touched the tax account at all. Instead, it had been wired, the very same week, into a private LLC registered to Derek and a business partner named Colton Reyes, a name I'd never once heard at my own dinner table. I learned, over the following weeks of careful, quiet digging, that Derek's development firm was drowning nearly $4 million underwater on a stalled commercial project, and that a forced guardianship over an incapacitated father with a fully paid-off house, a modest but real investment portfolio, would solve a great deal of that problem very quickly, and very legally, if nobody stopped to ask the right questions. I still had friends from 31 years on the bench, and one of them was a retired detective named Ray Kowalski, a man I'd worked alongside on a dozen difficult cases back when he was still with the county sheriff's department. Ray helped me install 2 small, legal, clearly disclosed cameras in the kitchen and living room, the kind any homeowner has every right to have in their own house, and for 6 weeks, those cameras quietly recorded everything. Melissa placing the capsules on the counter and standing there until she watched me swallow one. Derek on the phone in my own driveway telling Colton Reyes that the old man's already halfway there. The doctor's letter should be easy, the 2 of them coaching each other in the car before coming inside, visible through the front window, rehearsing which fabricated memory lapse they'd bring up that evening. I watched hours of it alone at night with a legal pad, the same way I used to prepare for a difficult ruling, writing down timestamps, building a record the way I'd trained myself to build one for 31 years. Not with rage, but with evidence. The guardianship hearing they'd been building toward finally arrived on a gray Thursday morning, and that is the courtroom I walked into at the start of this story, the one where my son wouldn't look up from his phone and my daughter-in-law let out that small, satisfied laugh at the sight of me shuffling in with my hat in my hands. They had a doctor lined up, a man named Dr. Halloran who, it turned out, really did exist, and who had apparently examined me exactly 0 times, but was prepared to testify to a pattern of cognitive decline based entirely on notes Derek and Melissa had fed him. They had their notebook of fabricated incidents. They had, they believed, an easy, uncontested morning ahead of them. What they did not have was any idea that the judge presiding over that courtroom, Judge Elena Marsh, had sat in my courtroom as a young public defender 20 years earlier, back when I mentored half the young attorneys who came through Fairhaven County, back when I personally helped draft the statute this state now uses to define financial exploitation of the elderly, the very law Derek's attorney was, with breathtaking irony, preparing to invoke against me. That's why her hand froze over the gavel. That's why she looked at me like she'd seen a ghost. 20 years is a long time, and I'd aged the way everyone does, gray and stooped and slower on my feet, but she knew my face. And more than that, she knew my name, because it was still printed at the bottom of the very statute in front of her. When my attorney, a sharp young woman named Priya Shah, who I'd once written a recommendation letter for during her clerkship, stood and asked the court's permission to submit video evidence rather than proceed straight to closing arguments, Derek's lawyer objected, confident, almost bored. Judge Marsh overruled him without even glancing up. What played on that courtroom screen took 11 minutes. 11 minutes of Melissa standing over me with a pill bottle. 11 minutes of Derek in the driveway, laughing into his phone about how easy I was making this for them. 11 minutes of two people rehearsing lies in a parked car outside the house where I raised their father, while inside a courtroom draped in the authority of a state I had served for 31 years, they'd been prepared to swear under oath that I was a danger to myself. I will not forget the sound of that courtroom when the video ended. Absolute silence, except for Melissa, who had begun, very quietly, to cry not from guilt, I don't believe, but from the particular horror of watching a plan collapse in real time. Derek didn't cry. Derek just stared straight ahead at the screen, his jaw working, the smugness gone from his face like it had never been there at all. Judge Marsh set down her gavel very deliberately and looked at both of them for a long moment before she spoke, and when she finally did, her voice was low and absolutely level. In my 20 years on this bench, she said, I have never seen a guardianship petition built on this level of documented deliberate fraud against the very man whose name is attached to the law protecting people like him. Petition denied. And I am referring this matter directly to the district attorney's office. Everything that followed moved with the particular speed the justice system reserves for cases nobody can look away from. Derek was charged with financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, wire fraud, and conspiracy. The paper trail into the LLC with Colton Reyes gave prosecutors everything they needed to unwind the whole scheme, and 6 months later he was sentenced to 11 years in a federal facility. His development firm dissolved, his name permanently barred from holding any position of financial trust in the state. Melissa was convicted of elder abuse and criminal administration of a controlled substance without consent, and received a 7-year sentence of her own, along with the permanent loss of her nursing license, the one credential she'd used to make doctor. Halloran's fabricated diagnosis sounded credible in the first place. They lost the house they'd financed on the promise of my money. They lost each other, too. In the end, I heard, through people who still talk to me, that Melissa filed for divorce from prison, though I take no particular satisfaction in that. By then, I had stopped needing to feel anything about them at all. I walked out of that courthouse on the day the sentences were handed down and drove myself home to the house Doris and I bought the year our daughter was born. And I sat on the back steps the way I always had, coffee in hand, and for the first time in a year and a half, the quiet didn't feel like grief. It felt like mine again. I worked with Priya over the following months to set up something I'd never had time to build during my career on the bench, a small nonprofit legal fund, seeded with what remained of my mother's inheritance, dedicated entirely to helping elderly people in Fairhaven County who suspect, the way I once refused to let myself suspect, that the people closest to them are not who they claim to be. We named it after Doris. It felt right that her name would be the one attached to protecting people the way I hadn't known. At first, to protect myself. I think about that morning in the courtroom sometimes, the way Melissa laughed when she saw me shuffle in with my hat in my hands, so certain that what she was looking at was a harmless old man who had already lost the only thing that mattered. She wasn't entirely wrong that I'd lost something. I lost a son that year. In every way that counts. And there's no courtroom victory that gives that back to you. But she was wrong about the man. Betrayal, I've learned, almost always wears a familiar face, dressed up in false concern, sitting across your own kitchen table calling you dad right up until the moment it doesn't need to anymore. You spend a whole life building something to hand down to your children, and you find out, if you're unlucky, that the person willing to take it from you was never a stranger at all. But I'll tell you this. For whatever it's worth from an old man who's seen more courtrooms than most people ever will, quiet does not mean weak, and slow does not mean finished. An old lion resting in the shade still has his teeth, and sooner or later, the truth always finds its way into the light, whether anyone in the room is ready for it or not. If this one stayed with you the way I hope it did, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, and tell me down in the comments, what do your grandkids call you, or what did you call your own father growing up? I read every single one of them, and honestly, on nights like tonight, hearing from you means more than I probably let on.